Hi there, my name's James Barron and I'm joined by my colleague Joshua Burke. We're both solicitors in the employment team at Forbes Solicitors, and we're here to talk a bit about some education news. Firstly, what we're going to do is we've got a few FAQs that schools have been frequently asked questions that schools have been asking us, and we're going to go through a few of those. And then we're going to talk about an interesting case to do with a teacher who had indecent images on their computer and were found to be unfairly dismissed when they weren't prosecuted. So we've just got two things we're going to talk about today. Should be a few minutes talking about each. So we'll move on now to the FAQ. So Josh, I'm going to go through some of these frequently asked questions and see what guidance you can give to schools. So I think the first question that's been coming up a lot, lots of schools have been contacting us about these standard letters they've been getting, which seem to have been copied and pasted, saying that they don't want their child to have a coronavirus vaccine. Would you just be able to provide us some guidance on what schools might be able to do to deal with these situations?
Of course, yeah. So the first point, what you mentioned there about a vaccine, at the minute, there isn't a coronavirus vaccine as far as we're aware. So I think on that point, I think that's quite an easy point to cover off if that is asked by parents of school, that there isn't one. I appreciate that this may have come around because obviously schools do administer vaccines from time to time. However, there's been no news, no government commentary that seems to suggest that schools will be forced to provide vaccines at any point. So I think the advice on that point is just to advise parents that there isn't one at this moment in time, but that you'll let them know if anything does drastically change in that regard.
Thank you for that, Josh. Now, next question we've got is, will pupils, and I think we can potentially expand this to employees as well, be required to take a coronavirus test?
Well, the minute the current guidance from the government suggests that by the autumn term, this is certainly the time of recording, by autumn term that schools will be provided with home testing kits that they'll be able to give out to parents and presumably, as you say, staff who may have developed symptoms at school. But that being said, schools, as we're aware, aren't going to be required to administer tests on site.
And a common question we're getting as well, Josh, is about hand sanitisers and hand washing for pupils. Would you be able to provide any guidance on the sort of advice you're giving to schools about that?
Yeah, so as we're aware, schools are required to implement policies and procedures as part of their risk management process for making school COVID secure. They're required to ensure that hands are cleaned more often than normal, particularly after pupils do arrive in school and when they return from breaks, when changing rooms or bubbles, before and after eating food, so around lunchtime, and after touching face, blowing nose, sneezing or coughing, for example. In terms of the specific products to be used, the guidance suggests that regular soap and water ought to be used. Now, we've certainly had questions around whether that you'd be able to force people to use alcoholic hand sanitisers. And I think our advice on that point would be, if the guidance suggests that soap and water is sufficient, then that is sufficient. But on a practical basis, if a parent perhaps isn't happy about the product that is being used at school, I think it's quite reasonable to ask the parent to provide their own soap for their child to use at school. So that's certainly the advice that we've been providing to our clients.
No, I think that's sensible. Next question that we keep on getting asked is, will pupils be required to have the temperature checked when coming into school?
Currently, the answer is no. There's no requirement at the moment to have temperature checks being taken at school. And I think the policy on this one ought to be that if that, for any reason, is to change, then that ought to be communicated to parents. But personally, I can't see that being something that may be brought in for schools to have an obligation to do with pupils.
In the event of an outbreak in the school, will pupils be required to give consent to the school to provide their details for NHS Track and Trace?
In the event sort of an outbreak of COVID-19, I think, well, consent isn't required to start off with, to share details with the government's NHS Track and Trace scheme. Schools can rely on the legal basis, which is the public interest disclosure rule under the GDPR, which is supported by current guidance from the Information Commission, which is the regulator of information. So I think on that basis that there's absolutely no need to obtain consent, because you have a legitimate reason to process that particular data.
Obviously, sort of the rules on this are changing quite regularly, but what's the current position and what schools can do regarding face coverings?
The current position on face coverings is that there's not a universal recommendation from the government that that face coverings become mandatory in all schools. It's been a bit of a case of that schools need to decide for themselves whether they, based on their own risk assessments, that it warrants face coverings. Particularly, this might be the case, for example, in corridors and heavily congested areas where that might be considered. But I think if you are going to require the use of face coverings in certain areas, certainly in those areas that I've just mentioned, then this should be clearly communicated. We would also give advise that there may be some exceptions to that rule, particularly around the area of disabilities under the Equality Act, and whether there are any reasonable adjustments that can be applied, which means that face masks may not need to be worn. So we'd advise taking specific advice if those particular reasons might be communicated to school by a parent, for example, and we can provide advice on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Josh. Question about shielding. Obviously, shielding is a sort of a bit of a grey area for lots of schools. One common question that schools get asked about is, what is the position with pregnant employees? What should they be doing with pregnant employees in the current situation?
Well, pregnant employees should, under the current guidance, the current schools guidance, is that pregnant employees can return to the workplace provided that social distancing, stringent social distancing, is adhered to. There's particular focus in the guidance on those employees who may be over 28 weeks pregnant, because those employees are considered to be at greater risk than those that haven't reached that period in pregnancy yet. Therefore, extra care needs to be taken with those particular employees. Again, you'll be covering these issues off in risk assessments to ensure that the workplace is safe for those employees. However, current guidance, which is medical guidance that you'll see is listed in that particular school's guidance, is actually linked. The RCOG guidance, that is, it is a bit of a difficult one, because we've certainly explored this point ourselves and looked at it, and it seems to suggest that would apply only to healthcare workers, yet the school's guidance does actually refer directly to it. So, and that guidance says that anybody over 28 weeks pregnant ought to remain at home. Therefore, there is a bit of a tricky issue there on whether that schools ought to be recommending that those employees remain at home. And I think, again, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, dependent on whether really stringent social distancing can be applied in the particular area where that person might work. But I think the safest option is always going to be to consider whether that person can work from home. Primarily, I know the guidance has recently changed today. I'm not proposing to go into that in any detail, but I certainly think that due consideration needs to be given to determine whether the duties can be carried at home. But again, it's going to be a case-by-case basis. We can provide specific advice on individual circumstances, which we think is best practice given the potential risk to those employees and the secondary risks that give rise under the Equality Act. So certainly advisable if your employees are in those situations to let us know, and we can provide further specific advice on your individual circumstances.
Next question I have is, and the final question for FAQs is, what are the school's options if they had started a performance management process before lockdown? Can they start the performance management process back up from where they last started?
I think in short, again, it's going to depend on the individual, the sort of stage at which you're at. But I think generally speaking, there isn't any reason why you can't continue the performance management process if you've paused it, because the employee won't have been performance managed during the time that you weren't in school. So I do certainly think that you can continue that. You'll have to be mindful, of course, of any potential risks, such as Equality Act risk, whether that person has a disability, for example, which might mean that they can't reasonably comply with the expectations on them to improve. But again, I'm sure everybody is aware that the best sort of course of action, if that is the case, is take specific advice, and we can help you guide through that process.
Thank you, Josh. And I think it's all what's worth saying about all these questions is the guidance is changing really regularly. So it's one of those things where consider what we said today a snapshot in time. We have been holding relatively regular FAQs regarding education queries with some of our colleagues from different disciplines, insurance colleagues, governance colleagues, dispute resolution colleagues. So if there are any specific queries that you do have, either approach one of us, or we do look out for when we hold at these events, because obviously the guidance can change quite regularly. So thank you for that, Josh. So now we've done the FAQs, I just wanted to talk a bit about the case that we were going to discuss, which is K versus L. Now, it's an employment appeals tribunal, and just for the benefit of those watching, I'll just briefly explain the facts and then we can talk a bit about it, Josh.
Of course.
What happened in this case is a teacher with 20 years unblemished service had been charged with finding indecent images on the computer at his home. Now, eventually the charge wasn't taken forward and he wasn't prosecuted, and part of the reason was he had a son who lived at home with him, and I don't think they could determine whether it was him or the son who accessed the images. However, the employer, which I think in this case was a council, a local authority, still decided to dismiss, and they decided to dismiss on the basis of reputational damage. Now, I think it's just worth, Josh, having read this case, what were the first things that sort of jumped out at you?
I think the first thing that jumped out at me was certainly the lack of investigation that had been carried out on that particular point. What the school ended up doing in that case was the reputational risk point was considered as part of the investigation, but then wasn't actually provided to the employee in the invitation to disciplinary. And at the actual disciplinary hearing, the reputational risk point was said to have been discussed in passing, to quote the judgment, rather than actually explored in any detail. So I think the local authority in that case were sort of struggling from the beginning with that, justifying that as an argument for dismissal, because as we know, if you're going to dismiss somebody and substantiate an allegation, you really do need to have put that allegation to the employee and give them opportunity to respond to that allegation. So I think that's certainly part of the reason why the local authority in that case fell down. Yeah,
I certainly would agree with that. I think part of the issue is reputational damage is always a hard one to establish. And you need to show there needs to have been actual damage. You can't just say there's the possibility of it. I think also, if I'm being honest, I think the problem they would have in this case is because it was a local authority. If you're a single academy trust, I think you could justifiably say, even if there's no press interest, you could justifiably say, if you're in a small community, everyone knows, the reputational damage is you can't come back even if you've done nothing wrong. The problem is in a local authority, when you've got maybe hundreds of other schools, there's always going to be another school that they could put in where they may maybe not have the same issues. And I think to a certain extent, multi-academy trusts may have the same issue. If you have a widespread of multi-academy trusts, widespread of academies, the multi-academy trust, there may be an argument to say you could have moved them elsewhere. I mean, I think, like you said as well, Josh, I think one of the things I found interesting was obviously they approached it from an SOSR reason because they didn't have enough information to dismiss for misconduct. And I think one of the things that jumped out at me was I think there was a potential where they could have done more investigation for into the misconduct issue. One key thing to always remember is that the burden of probability is very different in a criminal case to an employment case. In a criminal case, the CPS needs to do it beyond all reasonable doubt. In employment, it's on the balance of probabilities. So even if there wasn't enough information to go off, I think what happened in this case is the council relied a lot on the police investigation and didn't do their own investigation. I think they could have done a bit more and nudged it one way to say, on the balance of probabilities, I think this person did this, and that's not really what happened here. They just said they couldn't be certain that this person didn't do it, rather than saying on the balance of probabilities they did. And I think that's where another reason they fell down.
Absolutely, and we know that balance of probabilities, you could say that is equated to whether it's more likely than not than somebody's committed this offence. And I think in this case, they've really struggled to prove that because, like you just said, it was more that they couldn't say he hadn't done it rather than it was more likely than not that he had done it, which I appreciate is quite a nuanced thing. However, it really is a key point for these types of cases, particularly with SOSR, where it's certainly the risk of reputational damage, which it can be sometimes difficult to show, particularly without any evidence.
And I think one thing I'd say as well is that this is a good example of what happens a lot in these cases. Is unfortunately I've been involved in a few in my time and advising schools, and what happens is there's long delays. Unfortunately, in this case, I think the person was approached by the police in December 2015. It wasn't until December 2016 the school were able to take any action. I think as well, what I'd say is I think the school potentially missed a trick here and the council missed a trick. For those who've been sort of involved in schools for a while, they might remember we had that really awkward position where we had disqualification by association, where if someone lived in the same household as someone who'd been disqualified or would be disqualified from being around children, from a DBS perspective, that could cause issues. That was between 2015 and 2018 before it was abolished in 2018. Now this case fell in the middle there, so I think it could have been open to the employer to say, even if we can't say for certain it was you or your son, you live with your son and due to disqualification by association, we're going to have to dismiss you. Now that wasn't something that was put to the employee at the time, but it's also a key thing to remember that when you're looking at the fairness of a decision, you're looking at the decision at the time. If facts come out after the case, if disqualification by association had been abolished by the time the tribunal came to hear this, which it had in this case, that doesn't really get taken into account because you've got to take the facts as they were at the time. I think, Josh, what I'd say is, just to sum up, are there any sort of key lessons that you think schools and organisations can take from this case going forward?
I think, the first one being, as we touched on previously, it's the importance of a reasonable investigation. I think if there are questions that can be asked of the investigator, then perhaps more investigations may need to be carried out, and it's certainly open to somebody that might be considering the investigation at the next stage, i.e. disciplinary, as to if they think that further investigations may need to be carried out, that it's still open to them to adjourn and invite the investigator to investigate further. And that's certainly something that we see quite regularly, and you're not going to be criticised for that. In fact, quite the opposite. You're going to more be able to be in a position to be justifying what you've done if you've seen to be considered everything at least. So I think that's one point that I would certainly say. The second point, which I sort of touched on just somewhat briefly earlier on, which is if you're going to substantiate an allegation, then the employee that needs to have been put to the employee first, because the employee really does, you're always going to struggle to justify a protest as reasonable if the employee doesn't know what the case is that is against them. So I think that's certainly another sort of key takeaway from this case is put everything to your employee and then wait to see what the response is, and then you decide what you can substantiate at the disciplinary hearing based on the evidence. Have you anything to add on that point, James?
I think the only thing I'd add is I think the key thing to say is I wouldn't get too concerned if reading this case. I think some schools might see this and panic and think, oh, do we need to wait till a decision has been made before coming to a decision? And that's not necessarily the case. I think in these circumstances, what happened, it was a unique set of circumstances. But sometimes what happens is a bit more clear-cut, and certainly in my experience, where I've been involved in situations like this, the cases can be a bit more clear-cut, and it's easier to say, it's easy to say whether the person has done something or not. So it makes things a bit easier from that perspective. And certainly it can be difficult when someone does something outside of work and you can't be certain while police investigation is ongoing, particularly due to the delays that can often happen in these cases. So I think I would just say, just be patient, follow a proper fair process, and make sure you put everything to the employer, I think is probably the best bet. So that covers us in terms of that case. That's it today for our video. This is the first time we've tried out doing a video like this. If you like the format, please let us know. If you don't like it and you don't want to see mine and Josh's face again, please let us know and we'll go back to writing. It'll be absolutely fine. We won't be offended at all. But thank you for this. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact myself, Josh, or anyone in the employment team at Forbes. We'll be more than happy to assist. Thank you.
Thank you.